welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Stephanie Marcovici. She is a patient advocate, and we're going to talk about her Kevin MD article, The Consequences of Unmasking and Ending Quarantines. Stephanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
We'll get into the article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Okay, well, because we're going to be talking about two very complex, debilitating illnesses, I'd like to make 2 points first. And the first one is people are going to be watching this. They're going to be seeing me dressed, showered, sitting up, talking, smiling. And a lot of people are going to say, this girl looks perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with her. When in fact, there's unfortunately a lot wrong with me. It's on the inside. I'm a very positive person. So for instance, I'm not going to sit here and cry with you. I even have a website, stephaniemarcovici.com, where I try to help people. I give tools and tips on how to live your happiest life, and no matter what you're going through. I want people to realize that I may look healthy, but I'm not. Mm-hmm. So I'll talk more about how I'm not. But the other point is that a lot of people will be talking about ME, CFS, and long COVID. A lot of people think that those illnesses are depression. And so that's opposite to what I just spoke about. Because people don't understand these illnesses, they attribute it to depression. So as you can see, I'm smiling, I'm happy. I'm not happy that I'm sick, but I'm not depressed. That's not the cause of my illness. So I just wanted to throw those 2 points out there because in my experience as a patient, going to see doctors, even with family members, friends, people just don't understand that. I just wanted to preempt things with that. So sure. Back to my story, I was a healthy child. I was active. I played soccer, tennis, baseball, did well in school. I did have a bunch of illnesses though. I had H. pylori around age 7 where I had to be treated for it. I had recurrent strep. I had Epstein-Barr. And I'm mentioning these things because we think they may contribute to the illness that I have today. After I had those illnesses, there were a period of a few years from like 11 to 13 where I had dizziness. Nobody could explain it. I went to the best of the best. I'm sure your listeners know about Dr. Arnold P. Gold. He created the white coat ceremony. I saw him. No one could explain what was wrong with me. As I grew older, more and more symptoms started developing. And when I got through middle school to high school, I started getting fatigue. Now I was still functioning. So I was doing my schoolwork. I was taking honors AP classes. So I was working hard, but I was crashing on the weekends. I would come home, sleep basically Friday to Monday. But again, I was still functioning. Before I went to college, I started getting pain, which continued developing throughout college. By the end of college, I was basically running on adrenaline. And I don't know how I finished college, but I was able to push through. I got my BA in psychology. I got my teacher's license to teach kindergarten through 12th grade. I had a job lined up for when I graduated. But unfortunately, I never started that job because once I graduated, I came home and I crashed. And I'm talking now over years and years. I've been to at least 35 specialists, going to see doctor after doctor, trying to figure out what is wrong with me because all of the typical tests that are run, I come back normal. And so one rare thing that did come back positive was this autoimmune disorder. So I have been getting treated for that. And that is a reason why you see me sitting here talking, because when I was at my worst, I was lying in bed. Just the thought of rolling over in bed was torture. I was in pain. I was so fatigued. So that brings me to the more recent years of my current symptoms, fatigue. When people talk about fatigue, it's not just being tired. It's being so exhausted that you can't do daily tasks. My life basically consists of doing self-care tasks. I'm lucky to have my parents who prepare my food, who do my laundry, who do everything to take care of me. And that's the hallmark symptom of ME/CFS, which I was eventually diagnosed with.
And just to be clear, ME/CFS is myalgic encephalomyelitis, CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, correct?
Correct. And we patients love to use or prefer to use the ME part because, as I said before, chronic fatigue syndrome, when people hear fatigue, they just say, oh, okay, the person's tired. So the myalgic encephalomyelitis part really steps it up and says, hey, there's something actually medically wrong here. So yes, another hallmark symptom of ME/CFS is post-exertional malaise, where when you do the slightest exertion, and there are a range of patients. When I was lying in bed, just walking down the hall to the bathroom would be too much exertion, or sitting up or talking, or it varies per patient. Today, after today, and this is nothing, I wanted to do this podcast, but after today, I will have to rest and recover from doing it. And then, of course, I have a whole load of other symptoms. I call them my laundry list. I have this strange symptom no one understands, where if I eat just a regular or a minimal amount of food, I gain weight. Nobody understands that. I have extreme noise sensitivity. My parents have to whisper and be very quiet. Otherwise, my whole nervous system goes crazy. But patients with ME/CFS, there's a very wide range of severity, symptoms, but basically the hallmarks are fatigue, post-exertional malaise. The autonomic nervous system is often very disruptive. There are few people studying ME/CFS, but the people who are looking into it as a neuroimmune disease, a neuroendocrine disease, lots of inflammation. So a lot needs to be learned about the illness. It's very complex. It affects all the bodily systems. And so right now I'm in a place where I'm fighting day to day, trying to keep that smile on my face, and hoping and waiting and thanking the people who are working on this illness, because it will be solved. But in the meantime, I've been waiting for 13 years already now, and that's just me. So it's going to be a while until people can get their lives back.
And leading into your Kevin MD article titled The Consequences of Unmasking and Ending Quarantines, how have the last few years during COVID, how have they been for you?
For me, honestly, not much has changed, because I've been basically homebound for years and years already. Quarantining hasn't really affected me, because the only places I would go were to doctor's appointments. And I hate to say this, but a positive of COVID for me has been virtual appointments. So I've been able to have appointments with my doctors virtually and not even leave my house, which has made my life easier and harmed me less. So that has been a positive.
And as you write in your article, the CDC is relaxing COVID precaution guidelines, relaxing mask guidelines. So talk more about how that has affected the ME/CFS community.
So it's scary. It's very scary, because now it affects us, but I also want to explain how it affects everyone else. It affects really the entire population. We obviously know of babies and immunocompromised people who are unable to get vaccinated. And so if they get COVID, God forbid, who knows what would happen to them. There are patients like me with ME/CFS or other chronic illnesses who, trust me, our lives are bad enough. We really don't need anything else coming along and making our lives worse. We, unfortunately, with these relaxed guidelines of not having to mask, not having to quarantine as long as we used to, not social distancing, things like that, the burden is going on the patients, because we have to protect ourselves from everyone else. It should be a two-way street where we're protecting each other, but unfortunately, that's not the case now. One of the main reasons that I wrote this article was because a lot of people, most people, including doctors, don't know about ME/CFS. And what people are learning about now is long COVID. And long COVID, I have learned that about half of people with long COVID are turning into patients with ME/CFS. Now, as a patient with ME/CFS, I want to tell you, you do not want to end up like me. The whole point of my article basically is saying, be careful, please, because there are arguments that, okay, 95% of the population is protected because they were either vaccinated or they had the COVID infection. But on the other hand, we also know how contagious the current variant is, and we know how common reinfections are. Now, the research that has been started on long COVID, they've been finding things like microclots, neuroinflammation, regular inflammation throughout the body. 29-year-olds, I was reading a study, 29-year-olds are dying from strokes after having COVID. So healthy people can have long-term effects down the road. In the next few years, we don't know. That's one scary part, but also a lot of patients, whether you're asymptomatic long COVID, whether you have a bad case of acute COVID, to say, unfortunately, a lot of those people are going to turn into people with long COVID, many of whom will turn into patients with ME/CFS. And I worry for all of the people who may end up like me.
Now, from the research and reading that you're doing, are there any studies that show the frequency of people with long COVID eventually becoming those with ME/CFS?
I have seen that about half of patients with long COVID will end up with ME/CFS. The symptoms overlap. Now, I don't want to be quoted necessarily because there are organizations that have better numbers than I do, but the symptoms of long COVID and ME/CFS overlap. One big difference is that for ME/CFS, you have to have it for at least 6 months. So if someone is just at the 2 or 3 month mark, they may really have ME/CFS, they just haven't reached the time goal yet. But there's the fatigue, there's the cognitive issues. I'm sitting here, I had to prepare for this interview, and kind of ingrain what I wanted to say in my head because, and I even have a paper here in case I forget something because my short-term memory is bad. I'm 35 years old. I shouldn't have to be writing notes just to remind myself daily things to do or things like that. But yeah, so I can't tell you the exact number of patients, but we're in the millions because ME/CFS, I think in the United States alone, we're around 1 to 2 million of us with ME/CFS. People with long COVID, possibly, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe 3 to 4 million people. So if even half of those people turn into patients with ME/CFS, you're still talking millions of people. Now, in the world population, it's not necessarily a huge number, but a small number is still a big number. And you don't want to be one of those people. It's like winning the wrong lottery. You don't think it's going to happen to you, but then when it does, it's very unfortunate.
Let's say if you were speaking for the ME/CFS community and you were in charge of updated masking guidelines, for instance, in your ideal world, what would you do?
I would go back to what we were doing. So I would have people wearing N95 masks because we know those are the most protective masks. Wear them everywhere. I had a family member who was at a doctor's office yesterday, and in the doctor's office, the policy was optional for wearing masks. So people need to be wearing masks everywhere. And especially if you're exposed to someone with COVID, now you don't have to wear a mask. If you're exposed, please wear a mask. If you have COVID, you should be wearing a mask, but I really hope that you're staying home. And I would love for people to be staying home for the full 10 days instead of the 5 days that the CDC has now changed it to. We need to be as careful as we can be. We need to continue social distancing. We need to keep our indoor gatherings smaller. What we need to go back to or maintain what we have been doing, because that was saving lives. And in terms of saving lives, it's not just about people dying, because with ME/CFS, we call it a living death. And it's, again, like I said, you don't want to end up here.
We're talking to Stephanie Marcovici. She's a patient advocate. We're talking about her Kevin MD article, The Consequences of Unmasking and Ending Quarantines. We're talking about ME/CFS, which is myalgic encephalomyelitis / chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, you've talked a lot about this condition, and I just want to give you an opportunity to reemphasize some of the misperceptions about ME/CFS. If there was one misperception among not only the medical community, among the general population about ME/CFS, what would that one misperception be that you want to clear up right now?
It would probably be maybe two things that kind of go together, but depression, tired, and lazy, that we just don't want to go about life. Now, if you look at the definition of depression and how they get that diagnosis, it's because they don't want to do things in life and they don't get joy out of what they used to in life. People with ME/CFS, we have lists, we have long, long lists. We dream of the day of when we can do things like even being on a podcast. This is a highlight for me. I'm doing something with my life. We are not depressed, except when our illness causes depression, and then that has to be taken seriously. But that's normal. When you stop being able to have a social life, when you're stuck in bed, when you can't do daily activities, it's normal for people to become depressed. But the illness, ME/CFS, is not depression. We're not lazy. We're not just tired. We are exhausted. Our bodies literally cannot function. And if we force ourselves to function, then we get that post-exertional malaise where all our symptoms get worse. And we lose basically everything. And that's, again, just to go back to the COVID measures and long COVID, you don't want to lose everything. It's a scary place to be. I keep using the word scary, but it's the truth, because ME/CFS is the unimaginable.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
So people probably have gotten this by now, but my take-home message is please be careful. Take care of yourself, take care of other people, even if you don't know them. Again, you don't want to end up like me. Patients like me, we're waiting for research to be done. Now, this is a big point, that the research for ME/CFS is not getting funded. The NIH is not doing what they're supposed to do. The CDC is not doing what they're supposed to do. Congress may have to step in and force the government agencies to do research by providing funding and giving them guidance. They did that with long COVID. That may have to be done. But in the meantime, patients like me, we're waiting. There are organizations like the Open Medicine Foundation, Solve ME/CFS Initiative, ME Action, that are providing education. So I will add that in, that people should please educate yourself about ME/CFS, whether you're just a regular person going about life and you want to protect your family and your friends for the future. Learn about ME/CFS and long COVID so that you don't get it. And for clinicians out there, please educate yourself so that you can help patients with ME/CFS and long COVID, because there aren't many treatments, but there are some. And it's unfortunate when you go to a doctor and they either don't believe you or they don't know how to help you. So I would say it's education and funding for research, because the research is the only thing that's going to get people like me out of bed, out of the house, living our lives, contributing to society. We don't want to lose our entire workforce to long COVID. And education and funding for research, because again, you don't want to end up like me.
And for those interested in reading more about ME/CFS, what kind of resources do you recommend?
I do recommend the Open Medicine Foundation, or OMF, the Solve ME/CFS initiative, ME Action, or they do hashtag ME Action. They provide wonderful resources. There's the Work Foundation for those who think that we should, just get up and exercise, you're deconditioned, because that's another issue. The Work Foundation has information on how exercise harms people with ME/CFS. And they have research studies and protocols that are great. But even if somebody wanted to, there's Ron Davis at Stanford University who's a genius, and he worked on the Human Genome Project. He's like our leader in the community because unfortunately his son has severe ME/CFS and he is fighting tooth and nail. There's a working group this week of hundreds of scientists who are getting together and talking about the research that they're doing, potential avenues to follow. So if somebody wanted to donate even straight to Ron Davis, they could do that. But otherwise, I think the Mayo Clinic, I think they have followed, for instance, ME Action's resources and updated their guidelines. You have to be careful about where you look because there's inaccurate information and then there's accurate information.
Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing your story, time, and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.